School. We've all been there. It's boring, mundane, repetitive, and most often not catered to how we learn best. But why does it have to be that way? It was always status quo until I met a teacher that would flip my experience on its head. Mr. Akins. His class was different. He knew that students were capable of so much more than we had been given credit for. Topics were brought to life, and curiosity, discussion, debate turned his class into the best part of my day. I was tired of sharing stories about Mr. Akins and the crucial impact it had on my love for learning, so I've decided to bring him to everyone. This is the Best Teacher I've Ever Had podcast. Hello, and welcome back to another great episode of the Best Teacher I've Ever Had podcast. I'm Ryan, and with me, as always, my good friend, Eric. How's it going, Eric?
This is Eric. It's going well. How are you doing, Ryan?
Good.
Good evening.
Yes,
people.
Good evening. It's always a pleasure to... I think what people forget is oftentimes in podcasts, there's always like pre-recording conversation that happens, and then all of a sudden you have to stop and say, hey, just let's save all that for recording, and then you hit this button, and then you magically act like you weren't talking for some period of time. So it's always funny to kick things off.
I wasn't listening to you.
Okay,
so
well, good. Then,
you were talking, but I wasn't listening.
Then that makes it way easier.
It's just like our audience, right? So.
No, excited to be back with everyone. We've gotten some great, recently some great feedback from different individuals on platforms on the episodes. Those who have been listening and watching, just wanted to call out again that the support and the content here is made
thank you so much
possible by those who are willing to listen and engage, and many of you have in different forms and fashions. So I wanted start off with a couple logistical items and just kind of give a little bit of a preview to some things coming up. So just as we kind of started off the podcast, the inaugural episode was really a kind of a more candid conversation here with Eric about kind of this idea about this impact that he had made kind of as a teacher in my life, and we really wanted this to be kind of one of the core themes of the show. And so we are lining up hopefully some episodes that will actually deal with other teachers. And so we're going to have some other individuals on that we're going to talk and focus about people who are teaching in unique places, topics, individuals that either we know personally or have been recommended to the podcast. And then wanted to call out, there will be on the website, which reminder, bestteacherpodcast.com, there will be a new form at the bottom to submit a recommendation. So essentially you can go there and submit really what this is a person or a teacher or a mentor that may be teaching or has since kind of retired in a capacity where we can actually recommend to reach out and have them on the podcast. So bestteacherpodcast.com, that's where you can get all the content, and then this will be new. So at the bottom there'll actually be a button to basically say recommend a teacher, and this will be a way for us to actually reach out and have basically corollary kind of to the history aspect of the podcast, bring on other individuals to talk about teaching methods, things that they found helpful. Hopefully we'll get we want to get kind of a cast of people from different places as well as different age groups. I think that's really important when talking about what's successful in one environment versus a different age group. They're often very different, and talk about kind of why that is, and practical examples and work with kind of that sense. So I don't know, Eric, would it be different if you were teaching second graders history than it would be high schoolers?
Oh, of course, absolutely. One adjusts to one's audience. This is the nature of living, right? And so, but it would be fun. I always thought that second, third, fourth grade would be fantastic. I love that age group as far as learning goes. And they haven't learned that they're supposed to have an attitude particularly yet. And so I think, third grade in particular, I think especially that age. Fourth grade, they're beginning to sense, because they're looking at the fifth and sixth graders older than they are. And of course, by that age, they're trying to be cool, and they're aware of who's cool and who's not. And that sad aspect, reality of the social climate, social bubble of a school. Mm-hmm.
I just recently did some parent-teacher conferences, and all my kids are young, and it's interesting to see and walk through that with their ages and go through and have those conversations and be kind of in those shoes and see what it's like to actually be successful as a parent who's teaching, and working through the material at home, and then talk to teachers and see what they go through and the challenges that are much more difficult than I think oftentimes we remember. And I think that's where,
especially in this COVID world.
Yeah. So the good news is hopefully some of that's getting a little bit easier for kids to be back in person and to be, in learning environments that feel a little bit more similar. So I think that's a good trend. Hopefully things keep trending that way for all students. So those options are open. I think that's been a helpful kind of nice revisit for different families and different students for sure. Also wanted to shout out, as we do kind of at the beginning, one of the people that kind of was highly interested in kind of when we started the podcast was another student of Mr. Aikens here, Natalie, who now is Natalie Plummer, but who kind of reached out, and she is, for those who don't know, she has a very successful blog called Hello Meridian, and a podcast, the Boise Bubble podcast.
35,000 followers, I believe. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'll pop up some screens here. We'll have some links. And with someone else who kind of reached out initially and talked about the impact of Eric here and kind of some of her own personal endeavors with her creative space and her blog, and kind of the impact that made. And so I talked to her and was able to actually have her record something for the podcast, similar to kind of some of these readings that I've been doing about impact. And so we're going to go ahead and play that. And this is the first time Eric's hearing it, so hopefully we'll get this to work in the way that we want. So
I was a student of Mr. Aikens for 3 years. I had him for, I believe, AP English, U.S. History, and AP European History. And I believe he'd only been teaching about a year when I first came into one of his classes. What I would say about having the experience in his classes is that it unified his students in this excitement for not only the subject matter, but also this idea of figuring out how these things correlated to each other. And I feel like I couldn't take a test now and really do very well, I think, on any of those subjects. But what I came away from understanding was that the world is extremely complicated and more interesting than we could have ever imagined. And I felt this already budding thirst for that all of a sudden blossom. And for me personally, that went into what I studied in college. It went into writing, and it's helped me move forward into an extremely creative career that I have now. But what I know is that being in his class made us feel like we are part of something exciting in the human experience. And that is to learn how we work together, how complicated things can be, how we are not seeing through the correct lens if we're not looking through history, we're not looking through art. And that was profoundly important for me. So well done on starting this podcast, because it is very fun to know that we don't have to be limited to being in Mr. Aikens' class to kind of feel some of that excitement and passion. Thank you, Eric.
Thank you, Natalie. That was beautiful. I appreciate that. Yeah, one of the greatest things about being a teacher then, of course, is, for example, you 15 years after the fact reached out and contacted me, and I get to see, of course, how you have grown up, how you've matured, how you've become such a successful human being. And Natalie, the same thing, what she's doing. And it doesn't surprise me one bit. You know, you people were so gifted, and just, she used the word blossoming with potential back in the day. And to see people, you know, your former students, they are like your children in a way. And to see them thriving, you know, that's what every parent wants, and that's what every teacher wants. And so this was very gracious of you, Natalie, to reach out and to speak so eloquently about the past and about your current life, and still, you know, the impact and the impact that you, Ryan, and that Natalie, you are still having. You know, she has this media presence and this tremendous audience there in southern Idaho. So that's, yeah, it's amazing. And this is, of course, this new technology that's incredible, that's available. So here we are, right? Mm-hmm. You know, no longer teaching small grad seminars, but not the larger classes that I used to teach.
Yeah. Again, Natalie, thanks for doing that. Yeah. We're going to flash up again her blog, Hello Meridian, her podcast, The Boise Bubble. We'll have links here. Go check it out. I think if you're in that area, she's got awesome content, awesome recommendations, and can't say enough good things if you probably may have already heard about it. So we'll link that here at the podcast. And I think the other comment that I'd make, just off of your response in real time, Mr. Akins, is this idea also that I also get to engage with former classmates and friends who maybe don't have the most positive outlook on where they currently are based off of their circumstances for whatever reason. And I think one of those things that is really important as individuals is trying to make sure that, the technology also kind of enables this, we're really kind of, I can't remember this quote, I got to find this, but basically it says we're a depressed people that only have pictures of us smiling, and this sense of we're constantly sharing the things when it's positive. And so we kind of get this warped view sometimes of the world. And I'll just say that, most people's lives are very mundane and boring and normal. Oftentimes I think people get discouraged about that. And so I think wherever you are, whatever you're doing, there's always an opportunity to improve yourself, whether that's through reading, through self-education, through physical activity. And I love the ability to kind of evaluate and have meaningful kind of interactions with people that aren't always about where did you end up? How do you, and we've talked about this before in the podcast, like how do you measure success? And I think to do that financially or in terms of other kind of worldly metrics is really just foolish.
Mm-hmm. That was something I think, and Natalie briefly touched upon it. I think one of the things that made my class a little bit unique was my experience, that I had lived overseas for years. I lived in various countries, spoke different languages, and a lot of people in Eastern Washington growing up were not exposed to that in particular. So that for right off the bat, that this notion of a larger world out there, bringing in stories, and it was something that people felt for the first time in many ways, that they were actually being exposed to not just history, of course, but to this wider world that exists right now. And of course, we have these tremendous events that are occurring as we speak tonight, right? The types of events as the invasion of Ukraine that we did not expect to see again necessarily. And we thought that this type of we'll call it old-fashioned war maybe was obsolete. But here we go, back into geopolitical friction and one nation invading another nation. And we're not going to. Wait, Ryan, this is one of the things Ryan said. We were talking about this before this podcast began tonight, and this is not something we're going to go into in any detail tonight. But it's certainly, of course, there's a history behind what is going on in Eastern Europe, and it is something that is on our mind. And this is, of course, the role of history. That is to put things in perspective. And we'll talk about a period in the Roman Empire when there was 200 years of peace, and the idea of any kind of warfare or conflict within the Roman Empire seemed impossible at that time. And for 200 years, probably Western Europe and the Mediterranean basin saw the greatest period of peace that perhaps they've ever experienced. Mm-hmm. It was during the Roman Empire 2,000 years ago. And so these are things, right, we can discuss tonight.
Yeah.
And it all does touch. Obviously, that's the nature of the more you learn about something, of course, the more you want to keep learning.
Yeah.
And that's when your students come back and talk about that. And that's what's interesting, what you mentioned too about people. I have quite a few students who I had 25 years ago, 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and they are not necessarily happy. And that there are changes in their lives. There are things that they're doing. There are jobs that they are not madly in love with. But it is intriguing, right? When we'll start reminiscing and we'll start laughing, and it's one of those, we make a connection in that way. Mm-hmm. So it's not as if everyone just left Central Valley High School or Gonzaga University, went off and just had this tremendous life. Life is continual, obviously, voyage, a journey.
Yeah.
And use again all these different metaphors that we can possibly use.
Yeah, no, and I think one of the things, and then we're gonna get into the history here, is oftentimes those difficult scenarios are better teachers of life lessons than when everything goes smoothly. And I found that to be true when adversity and sometimes a kind of manageable conflict are front and center. It feels insurmountable. It feels like there's no end to this. That things aren't going well, and that you tend to find those who work through that more frequently are more well-rounded and can handle and become deeper in their understanding of life and experience. So just because things aren't going well doesn't mean that you're not getting nothing out of it. And I found that to be true as well.
Well, Gonzaga losing last night, right? this is going to be good for them, as they go into, as they continue on in life and they try to attain their goals. They're fairly limited goals, but, it's funny. Each season is like a lifetime for the players and for the fans, if you're a sports fan. And so, Gonzaga lost to St. Mary's last night. And so and there's books writing about that. There's Pat Conroy. He's a fantastic American author from South Carolina. And he wrote The Prince of Tides and Beach Music and Lords of Discipline, The Great Santini. And one of the last books he wrote was a autobiography about his senior basketball season at the Citadel, the university he attended in South Carolina, Charleston, South Carolina. And he delves into that whole idea, explores the notion of how actually he learned so much more from this losing season that he had as a senior when he had all these expectations for the contrary than he ever would have or ever did from any other winning experience. And that this is something not just in the sort of the trite way that it sets you up for life. Of course, it's a life experience because life's not always just a bed of roses, but just these other lessons that become embedded and that you really you mature and you grow wiser from oftentimes adversity. And so and I think this again, it's a little bit of a cliche, but it's one worth repeating.
Yeah, and maybe as we transition here kind of into, and we talked about this in the last episode, but we kind of are going to use this episode to kind of round out the Romans. And one of the things I think we wanted to do that's challenging in this setting is like, it's not this classroom environment where you're very familiar and comfortable with being able to engage a group of a smaller group of students to talk about how do you kind of digest this information. And so one of the questions I think we wanted to lead out with and kind of get your feedback on is this content is dense. The details can be mundane. They can definitely be presented in a boring way. How do you start bridging from inception of the topic? Because that's where you can lose kids very quick, right? Even the topic of Shakespeare, right? You just mention that and people are like, oh, the eyes roll back and they just become disinterested. How did you find it as a teacher being able to say, I've got this challenging topic that I know the kids are capable of. What type of ways would you mix things up to provide ways to teach that weren't just lecturing or just reading content and review? What did you find helpful?
Well, and this gets back to that first episode where we talked about education and you were presenting the notion of what you thought made my class fairly singular. First of all, of course, was a Socratic method. It was a discussion method, and I would ask them questions. And of course, this podcast, that's just not possible. I'd love to be able to ask whatever audience we have out there, the 21 people who watch.
Yeah, maybe we'll live stream one episode.
There are more listening. But yeah, I would just, it'd be wonderful to be able to engage and ask you questions and then have you ask me questions. And of course, just in the format with the two of us, it doesn't work in that same way. But also there, for example, assessments and, not just names and dates and straight lecture, those types of old school teaching can be such a drudgery in the classroom. And so, for example, the types of things we would have, let's say we're doing a unit on Rome. Let's say the centuries, where the fall of the Republic and the burgeoning empire under Caesar Augustus. And so I would say I would have a group project where I'd have students get into groups of 2 or 3 and they would create a Roman newspaper. And in that newspaper, they would have to have an editorial. And the editorial would explore the notion, is Julius Caesar and his vision for an autocratic empire, is that the way that Rome should head, or should it go back to the Senate and more to the model of the Republic? And again, to explore, right, that basically giving them a chance to regurgitate and express and articulate what it is, the content that they have been learning, that we've been discussing, that they've been reading about. And in that newspaper too, I'd have them do a political cartoon. You remember these types of projects that we would do, right? And so much, the satire that would be available that they could do on the different, on Cicero, on Crassus getting the gold poured down his throat, on Pompey the Great, and Julius Caesar himself, and Brutus and Cassius. And then they have interviews with the Roman man and woman in the street, and perhaps with slaves. And these would be all things that would be laid out. All of these things must be included in your Roman newspaper. You come up with the name, and you give them a really loose framework, and then you just let them go. You give them these ideas. You say that, of course, you must include this content that you have been learning, so you have to reflect that back to me. You have to be able to demonstrate that you have learned something. You're not just making something up. But in fact, that when you interview the man in the street, they're talking about the very things, the very names and dates and the events that we've been talking about. Perhaps they're talking about their plebeians, and they're grumbling about the patricians and the fact that the patricians control the Senate. And actually, Julius Caesar is a man of the people, and he's generous. And Mark Antony's speech the other day. And so this would be the kind of assignment. And these are the things too. It's unbelievable what students could achieve. And this is where you begin to go, wow. If you break out of the worksheet format, where you come up with this dry piece of paper with these silly little questions that are checking for knowledge, and instead you allow them some kind of creative format in which to explore their knowledge, what they do know, to compel and them to think, to reflect upon their learning. And if they begin to reflect upon their learning, it goes back to where you're changing the physiognomy of your brain, and you're actually learning. You're bringing new knowledge, new ideas, your content and ideas into your head. And or for example, if you're doing ancient Greece, the golden age of Athens, right? And I had mentioned, imagine you're either sitting on the steps of the Parthenon, or you're at the house of Pericles, the orator, the general. He was called the general, not in a military sense, but a general who's in charge of the city-state of Athens. And you're at the house of Pericles on a Saturday night, and Socrates is there, and he's questioning everybody in sight about their policies as they begin to head towards war with Sparta. And the playwright Sophocles is there talking about his latest play, Oedipus Rex. And the historian Thucydides is there, perhaps, and he's asking questions because he's excited. He's going to get to write about a war, perhaps. And Pindar, the poet, is reading his odes over in the corner. And so I would give this assignment, and they would get it going maybe in the classroom. And that this last one, for example, where they're writing about an evening in the house of Pericles, typically that would be an individual assignment. But what they would produce would be so much more exciting and relevant than an essay, oftentimes. And they would come back maybe 2 days later when it was due, and these kids would write 5-6 pages. And because they're effectively writing, it's almost a fiction template that they're working with. And so these are the types of assessments that I really loved. And of course, this is not something we've been talking about. As we've been delivering this, I've been talking endlessly in these various podcast episodes. But always there would have been this check for learning. And with these types of assignments, when we talk about the medieval world, if you remember that project where I had you create a medieval manor, and you had to come up with a map, and you had to come up with the heraldry, the coat of arms, and where in Europe your particular medieval manor was, how many people were there, what the name of your lord, the lord's family, the diary of one of the people in the lord's family who was literate. And so these types of projects were always the kind of thing that got kids ignited, got them excited about what they were learning, what they were basically exploring. And that whole idea of exploration is exciting. Sitting back, of course, and just being a cipher is not exciting. But when you can somehow reach inside and turn the little light on, and you can see the light turn on. So in classes that were not advanced placement, I would oftentimes have what's called a Fun Project Friday, and I would string together a whole series of projects. They would get together in groups, and they would come up with signs for a coal strike in the early 1900s, discussions about whether the national park system under Teddy Roosevelt was a good idea, the Panama Canal, and these are all things happening in the early 1900s in America. And it's amazing what kids can come up with, given the opportunity, given the chance to work outside of the academic box. And granted, this type of thing is not always done in college, but that type of thinking, that level of thinking, that way of engaging oneself with the knowledge, reflecting upon it in a creative, critical way, that is, of course, at university. And that should be the heart and soul of any university class as well. And it may not be done in these types of creative projects. One of my favorites, too, was when we're doing the Renaissance and an evening at the Medici household, and you're a young artist, and you're invited by Lorenzo the Magnificent, and you get to go to the Medici Palace there in Florence, and the year is 1487, and Lorenzo is there, and young Michelangelo, and Leonardo da Vinci, and Botticelli, and the Neoplatonic writers Pico and Ficino, and what the student would have to do then is, an idea would be then that they would go home to their garret flat there in Florence, where they have their canvases set up, and they are so blown away by what happened that evening that they write in their journal. And this was the assignment. And they would talk about the philosophies and having a discussion with Michelangelo and the artwork and refer to the specific works of art. And again, I would just see kids get really so involved and worked up in a good way about these types of chances to show what they're involved with learning.
Yeah, and I can speak from personal experience
and video projects, right? Because I thought of you, I looked at you, and I thought, oh yeah, your video projects that you guys would do.
So, and these are ones that definitely. I remember as you're talking about some of these examples, 100%. I remember doing the Roman newspaper and some of these other activities, and then oftentimes in these classes we would have an opportunity to do a video. And I remember. And I'll talk a little bit about why I think this is crucial, but I think there was 4 of us, we're all good friends, and we decided to do like a Lego stop motion film that took us, the amount of hours we put into that was probably more than any class we'd ever done.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it, what you'll do though, if you're excited about it.
And because we had fun, and here we are adding our millennial flavor to it, so we're pulling rap songs, we're making it funny, and because of it, we're to your point, we're kind of untapping this limiter in our brain that says, oh, like I have to learn in a certain way, and it's saying, no, this is your opportunity to actually like give your personality into something that's going to be seen by the class. And because of it, usually, and this is what I think is so crucial about this idea is, I struggled with this idea to your point of you learn a concept, you take a test, we test your knowledge, and I get why that's important for standardized testing. It's important for certain types of placements, but it's challenging for many in a way to kind of actually show and display what they know. It's not all inclusive of everything. And so in the real world, I had a teacher in college who said, we're going to take a test. It's closed book. You can't use any resources. And quickly as I found out, as I began working in the professional space, that's never the scenario. The scenario is, here's a team. You're a member of a team usually. We have a project or an initiative or a delivery. Go solve it with whatever resources you have available, and the world is your oyster. And it's like, oh, you've got the internet, you've got books, you've got whatever you need to be successful. If you need equipment, we'll make sure you have equipment. And so it was really this. And now looking back to your point, I would wish we had more opportunity to say, here's opportunities to take a group of your classmates and an assignment where the rules are less rigid. There is an expectation of what I want to be delivered, but you got to go do it in the way that you best see fit. Here's a few things that I want you to follow. And always, I can't remember a single scenario in which that was the case, where the content and the material and the memory wasn't way more firm in my head. I can go back and talk about those things because we did the movie, like that scene, or an Othello. Like I remember that to this day because I had this experience where, to your point, I made this connection, this creative connection with my brain and the content to form really a lasting memory of that information, and not just, oh yeah, I read that quote about, from the play that was like 20 years ago. There's no way I remember it. And I think that's the difference. And oftentimes that opportunity gives, I think it also gives students a chance to explore a creative side. I mean, you think about journalism, someone who's a very talented writer, but they don't get an opportunity to do a lot of creative writing. And all of a sudden they're writing this Roman paper and
excuse me for a second, Ryan, but yeah, just to add what you're saying, but essays should be creative. Your formal academic essays really ultimately, to be truly successful, they should be creative, whether it's a document-based question or just a more standardized essay question. And that is so oftentimes forgotten or neglected, or even there are many professors, many teachers who feel that it should not be. That creativity has no role in the academic setting, and that's just dead wrong. And I think everyone who thinks back about a positive learning experience, it always engaged people at an intellectual level as well as a creative level, if not artistic. And so I'm sorry, I sort of threw you off the track there a little bit. You were on a roll.
No, but I think that's 100% right. And because it's hard, because I think without those experiences, like, how do you give someone the positive feedback to say, oh, like, is there a career for me in journalism that maybe I wasn't even thinking about? Is there a career for me in video editing? Because I just excelled in this project beyond, like, I mean, the quality was top shelf. This person spent a bunch of time. Or was it, an opportunity, in a chemistry or a biology class to actually do, a project where they had to go interview or shadow a doctor and get that experience, like all of these things that actually kind of open up your mind to that very difficult kind of almost like inevitable kind of doom question of, what are you going to do when you grow up? What are you going to do? And tell me now. And that's like, figure it out. And if you don't do this, then you're stuck. And I think that's just what's frustrating for students.
Yeah. And I think Natalie, she said in her video that, if we were to do a specific test on a given unit, let's say the Renaissance, and if I were to ask, well, who are the two foremost Neoplatonic philosophers? Well, very few students are going to be able to remember Ficino and Pico. But they'll remember the Renaissance. Mm-hmm. They'll remember probably the Medicis. They'll remember Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci, and even like the work, the School of Athens, that when we started talking about that painting in regards to the Golden Age of Athens, you remembered that. And this is that notion of having that scaffolding of history from the Greeks through the Romans, through the medieval to the Renaissance. And then again, the same thing is true with the Reformation and Martin Luther and what happened with the church and the break from the Catholic Church. Mm-hmm. And to have this general idea of the flow of history, to not be someone who is completely cut off from their story, from their backstory. It would be someone, the way Americans oftentimes, and it's unfair to say only Americans, people in the world today, can be in regards to history, is if they really don't know anything but what's going on in the world today, it's as if they don't know anything what's going on in their own life. They're 32 years old, and they basically have forgotten or neglected everything that had gone on in the previous 31 years. Mm-hmm. And that's what it's like if you don't engage with your history, your country's history, your world's history. And that's the value, I guess, of media like this, is to explore it in a different way. I can't come up with those projects. I can't say to the readers out there, okay, I want you to create a Roman newspaper, or to give me a sense, of Alexander the Great and have the diary of Alexander the Great, or we're at the museum, the library in Alexandria in the 3rd century BC. And, having some of the professors there, and they're having a dialogue and write this little play. And those are the kinds of assignments we would do. And of course, again, this is where you see people wake up to the possibilities of learning and being excited, and the memory of being excited and engaged. And here's the key. No, of course, you're not setting them up for a specific career. But one of the most important things any teacher worth her salt can do is to give her students a love for learning, and also provide the means to keep on learning, to teach people how to learn, to teach themselves how to learn. They become their own teachers throughout their life. They become that life artist where they approach each day like a blank canvas, and then they begin to, of course, create their daily work of art. And this, if you can give them, and this is why learning mathematics in high school, even if you're not going to have a career that engages mathematics, involves it in any way whatsoever, but you are learning and you're training your brain. And these are all processes which, of course, help you to continue to learn throughout your life.
Right.
So when you're 46 years old and you want to learn something new, whether it's a whole set of skills regarding technology, or if it's a whole set of knowledge that you want to learn about the Roman Empire, that you still have the ability to learn. And you never, of course, allowed that to atrophy. Because somewhere back in your history, in a classroom, you had a teacher who emphasized that idea, and of course gave you the tools, life tools that will always allow you to learn something new. Yeah. And so that's of course what a teacher should be able to do.
Yeah, I love that. And the last thing I'll say there is also just on the professional side. I remember I have a dear friend who's a mentor who I worked for, and one of the most intelligent, competent people I know. And we worked very closely together. And sometimes I felt like I was a drag on him to ask questions because his time was it was valuable. It was, and, one time I apologized. I said, hey, sorry to ask you this. And he goes, I wouldn't tell you the answer if I didn't think you valued it. In the sense of, he saw that I was actually I wanted to learn. I was asking the question because I cared, and I wanted to
That's
learn.
why I wanted to do this project with you as well. No, seriously, it's when you approached me with this idea for what this was, I could see that, yeah, you wanted to reconnect with me, but you also, you just had these fond memories of the experience of being in my different classes, which of course is absolutely flattering, but also at the same time is exactly what we've been talking about. You look back upon this time as an exciting time of learning, and you kind of wanted to recapture that and to share that then. These possibilities that learning, if you approach it in the proper way, in the proper fashion, that it can be one of the most exciting things there is in life. And that's what travel is all about, right? Mm-hmm. Learning a new language, learning a musical instrument. And these are things, there's a commercial right now with Ewan McGregor from Scotland. And he's talking about regrets in life. Do you have regrets about the things you didn't buy, or do you have regrets about the places you didn't go? And of course, even more so, perhaps the people you didn't meet. Mm-hmm. And if you had never done this, right, taken this opportunity to reach out to me and say, what do you think about this podcast? And the same thing with me. If I had said no, I'd be missing out on so much. And that's where, this travel is such a fantastic way. It's a great metaphor for learning, isn't it? I mean, you are literally learning. Right. It's not just a metaphor, but it also at the same time, that's what you're doing in a classroom. You're traveling. Yeah. You're traveling through history. It's a time machine. A good history class, a good history podcast, hopefully, is a little bit like a time machine. Mm-hmm. And we've always been really fascinated by stories, dealing, I should say, with time travel. Yeah,
and I think the last recommendation I'd make is the reason it's worth revisiting these stories, just like the reason, I think this is very, similar in a way for those who are religious and read, religious text, is you're constantly reading or learning about a story that may be relevant to something you're going through in your life. And so it's so great to kind of, history repeats itself. Like, we should learn from the history. It's because these lessons are, they're at their core fundamental and true. And so, yeah, you forgot about the specifics of, something from the Renaissance, but then maybe as you're listening to the podcast or reading a great book, you hear something, or you hear, the way they described the art and how it moved them. And it's something that you needed in that day. And so I think the value of that is also just enriching your life in the sense of, if you're looking for ways to apply learning, it can be applied in every single way, and don't limit that. And I think that's, something that we share, and one of the ethos for the podcast, which is why, again, we're going to try to spend some time talking to other teachers and educators and mentors, because I think that's core to what we want to share, on top of, having some great lessons about history that I think are worthwhile. I mean,
these are, history, ideas, art, poetry, literature, philosophy. These are the things that we live for. And I'm basically paraphrasing, Robin Williams, Mr. Keating from Dead Poets Society. And he said, business and marketing and finance, those are wonderful things, of course, and they are things that enable us to live. But poetry, art, philosophy, the history of ideas, these are the things that we basically live for. And this is where a culture like ancient Athens, the golden age of Athens, and perhaps Rome during the Pax Romana, and Florence in the Renaissance, and let's say French culture today, this idea of savoring life, of the joy of life, that life is, so they have 7 to 9 weeks of vacation a year in France. It's one of their priorities, that you work to live, you don't live to work. And the role of beauty and seeking beauty and love and poetry, that these are things that are more valuable than other things, and they're worth exploring and creating and savoring. And you can do that in food, or, of course, or art itself, or architecture, or city planning. So these, you find a way of living in the world that engages so many different aspects of your life. And that's, of course, where education needs to continue. Yeah. That if you can help your students fall in love with the idea of learning, and they continue to do so, if they continue to be a student of life, then wow, you feel as if you are truly a success. Yeah. And that's when I run across people like Natalie and yourself, and so many other students, and that's where social media really plays a role. That I can go, wow, that's fantastic. Even if they're not maybe where they want to be vocationally, nonetheless, there's still there's so many things that are exciting about this individual. So.
Yeah, there's some of the people that I respect the most that I've ever met that by standard of economics wouldn't weigh, and I think that's very telling. So I think this is a great segue. So one of the things we know that in this at the kind of our wrapping up of Rome, we're not going to go into every single emperor and all of the details of the fall because it's too dense. But one of the things I think was really interesting that we talked about that we want to explore, very similar to this conversation, is what was it actually like to be a Roman? Like there's this kind of idea of like what does daily life look like? We have a lot of these things memorialized and they're kind of romanticized, but what does the kind of day-to-day look like for an average person? And I think that's something that we wanted to spend some time on. Okay,
we ended with the transition from a republic with the Senate in charge to an empire with an emperor, a totalitarian state, an autocratic figure, Caesar Augustus in particular. And in the 1st century AD now, and we're on the other side of that date when Jesus was born. And in the 1st century AD, it's the Pax Romana is the peace of Rome. Pax Romana is Latin for the peace of Rome, and historians, scholars refer to that period as the reign of Caesar Augustus from 27 BC, so 27 years prior to the 1st century AD. Again, remember Jesus probably was born in 4 BC, the year that King Herod died, and then for the next 180 years up through the reign of Marcus Aurelius. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius. So this period of 207 years is called the Pax Romana. And it's called that because within this massive Roman Empire, within the empire was at peace. This is very unique in human history, where you have this large of a territory, a footprint. On the borders, the frontiers of the empire, the Roman legions were fighting the Germanic barbarians up in the northeast, on the northern side of the Danube River in Central Europe. And far in the east, the old Persians called the Parthians or the Sassanids, depending on what period. They kept changing their name, as they're called Iranians today, or Iranians, you choose. And so during this period, the 1st and 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire, what was it like to be in Rome? Well, the city of Rome was 1 million people. Alexandria was perhaps over there at the mouth of the Nile River in Egypt. Part of the Roman Empire was about 500,000. There were other very large cities, about 150,000 to 200,000, Ephesus and Antioch in the Middle East and in what is now Turkey. Constantinople itself, which eventually is founded in the 4th century, becomes a city of 500,000 people as well. But that's a little bit later. Rome, outside of Rome in the Western Empire, let's say if we go up into Gaul, into Provence, most of the cities, like the famous city called Pompeii, are cities about 20,000. And they would have a wall around it. But the life for the middle class, the equites, the equestrian order, this new emerging, who were the judges, they were the tax collectors, they were the bankers, they were the importers and exporters, the very wealthy merchants. This is, it's based on the Roman engineering and technology. And these things which were lost during the medieval period. So, for example, we've talked about some of them. The Romans, unlike the Greeks, built for beauty. They wanted to create, of course, the Acropolis and have it be something worthy of the gods themselves. The Romans wanted to build something great to glorify themselves and their empire. And so they had the type of engineering that could build the Colosseum, which is 14 stories high. And you have these 4 different levels of the Colosseum. And it could seat anywhere from 50,000 to 80,000, depending on what period. Because the Colosseum was basically being used for 500 years. Mm-hmm. You remember there used to be a building called the Kingdom in Seattle, which was built in the 1970s. And then in the late 1990s, I believe, only less than 30 years later, they destroyed it. It was obsolete. The Colosseum survived for 500 years. The Circus Maximus, which was for the chariot races, this was a culture, a civilization that was so organized that they could build an arena that seated 250,000 people. So for the chariot races on a weekend, and you had the 4 different factions, you would have a quarter of the city's population going to the chariot races. 250,000. Our largest stadiums, for example, Michigan Stadium, is 110,000. They seem huge. The Rose Bowl that seats 100,000. The Colosseum that seats less than 90,000 because much of it is closed off. And so the Circus Maximus, which sat 250,000 people,
Yeah, just the hot dogs, and the churros alone. Those logistics.
Yeah, and they did. They had the vendors out there. They had, for example, the Coliseum had 64 what they called vomitoria, because basically the people were vomited out. These were the exits, and you would actually see inscribed in the stone, of course, above the vomitoria, you would see the word exit. Why would the word exit be above a Roman exit? Well, it's a Latin word, right? Mm-hmm. It just means way out. And so this was the Colosseum. We'll talk a little bit about the Colosseum too at some point. But I'm trying to give an idea of the extent, right? To have a city of 1 million people like in Rome. And we'll talk about, I guess, if we're going to talk about daily life, let's talk about the city of Rome. Mm-hmm. And I think it would be a good idea right now. For example, I'm going to give some names, and then I'm going to expect you, Ryan, to come up with images that match them, okay?
Okay.
First of all, the Pont de Garde aqueduct, you've already shown that, but that's in the south of France. And I'm going to mention there are 2 different arenas, amphitheaters they're called, where the gladiators fought in southern France, in Provence, the Roman province there in southern France, in southern Gaul. One is in the city called Nîmes. That's where the Pont de Garde aqueduct actually went to provide water for the city of Nîmes. And the other was in the city called Arles. And these are both gladiatorial arenas that could seat 25,000 people. So effectively, almost the entire population of the town could fit into and would watch the gladiatorial games, which were free. In virtually every metropolitan area of the empire, the people would get free bread, and they would get free circuses, the entertainment. You have in the city of Orange in the south of France, you have this fantastic theater where they would have the plays and the music performances. And this is again something that hopefully you can find an image of this theater in Orange. These tremendous, some of the best Roman ruins are actually in the south of France. Because Rome was a huge city, and what happened is people during the Middle Ages used the stone of all the this fantastic city of marble that Caesar Augustus built, and they used all this marble. They tore these things down. The most extant, and again, we need to have an image of this, is called the Pantheon. It was built during the reign of the Emperor Hadrian. It was begun under Augustus, but it was perfected under the Emperor Hadrian, and now we're talking about 120 AD. Mm-hmm. So this is all during the Pax Romana. So you have within the city of Rome itself 1 million people. That means you have to have the infrastructure, logistics to be able to bring in enough food for 1 million people every day. On the streets of Rome, you would walk through all the paved roads in the city of Rome. You would have these piazzas where the daily markets where people could do their shopping. On the ground floor of virtually every building were shops. And so you would have tailors, you would have blacksmiths, you would have cartwrights.
It's like similar to how we do it today.
Yeah, you go to any European city, and that's the way it is. I lived in Paris for years, in England, and you have the ground floor is the shops, and above that are the residential areas. Mm-hmm. And this was the way it was. The people who, they would live above their shops. And these are the working class people, right? And many, just like in Rome today, probably about half of those shops, as you walk through the city of Rome during the Pax Romana, let's say in the 1st century, under the reign of Emperor Nero, for instance. It's the year 62. And this is right about the time that St. Paul and St. Peter are in Rome as well. And you're walking through the streets. Most of them are food shops. You can go up and get different types of food. Right there, a stand. It's like a takeaway shop, right, or to go where you can go
Fettuccine Alfredo and meatballs.
Absolutely, or gelati, right? Maybe they didn't have gelati back then. And gelato, right? And so it was just a buzz, right? The travel, there's a great, I was reading recently a book with the letters of Horace, who was a poet in the 1st century BC. And one of his friends was saying, why don't you compose your poems? Why don't you compose your poems? Because you complain, Horace, you complain about not having enough time to write your poetry. And because you're always traveling, you're going from this house to another house on business, on errands. Well, why don't you? Because you'll walk 30 minutes to get to one friend's house, to Marcellus's house. Why don't you compose poetry on the way there? And he said, well, no, because on the way to Marcellus's house on the Palatine Hill, I'm going to go across a work crew. There's going to be a work crew that is constructing some building, and they'll have a crane that is lifting up some massive log or some huge pediment of stone, and they'll be shouting, and there'll be dust and dirt, and then there'll be some funeral procession going by with the professional mourners screaming to high heaven, and then there'll be some mad dog being chased by its owner through the streets, and then a pig that escaped the shop where, of course, they sell the little pork shish kebabs. And he said, and this is Horace writing in a letter describing all the distractions that you see in the city of Rome. And you have, in the heart of Rome, you have the Forum. And the Forum is where the temples were. It's where the Senate was. You have banks there. You have the hills surrounding the Forum. You have the rostrum from which the people could speak. It's the heart of the sewer system. I didn't mention the fact that the Rome, not only did it have anywhere from 10 to 14 aqueducts bringing in these massive amounts of fresh water into the city, and the thousands of fountains that were spread throughout the city, many for aesthetic reasons. They wanted it because fountains are pretty, right? So they'd be in a piazza and there'd be trees growing around them and flowers, but also this is their source of fresh water. Everyone, all million people who lived in Rome had access to fresh water. The people who lived in middle-class arrangements in housing or above actually had fresh water in their homes. They had hot and cold running water in their homes. And the entire city had a sewer system. It had both a sewer system and then a drainage system. And so the storm drains, which would have the clean water, and then, of course, the sewage system. And so you're going sewage system, or people, a middle-class family would have in their home. Here's what a typical Roman house would look like, okay, for a middle-class family or above. The equites, the equestrian order. And let's say this is someone who is a banker. He imports grain from Egypt, perfumes from Arabia, silk from the Far East, from China, the Silk Road. And he sells them in various shops throughout the city of Rome. He has land out in the countryside where he grows olives for olive oil and olives themselves. He has vineyards. And so this is someone who has many different business enterprises. So this is what his house would look like. It would be on the ground floor of a building. Probably he would rent out the area adjacent to the street to shops, to shopkeepers, to people working class, right? Artisans. So perhaps food shops or a carpenter or a cobbler, right? Someone who works with shoes or sandals. And you would have their entryway. They called it a janua, which is the word January. So on the threshold, you're looking both ways. You're looking both in and out. So this is the word January. Janus is the god of gateways or portals. And you're looking both backwards to the old year and forwards to the new year. So hence the name January for the first month of the year. Janus. Interesting. So the Janua. There was no J in the Latin. It was the letter I. So Julius Caesar actually was Julius, and would have been pronounced Kaiser. Yeah, just like Cicero would have been pronounced Cicero.
There's that
and
famous
no one says Cicero.
Scene in, just to cut you off, that famous scene in Indiana Jones, right, where he's stepping on the Roman letters, and he basically steps on J for Jesus or whatever. There's no J in Latin, and he almost falls, right? Like that's the classic.
Yeah, just like there was no U. So it would have been J. It would have been IV, the beginning of Julius. Yeah, the N would have been pronounced Julius, not Julius. So right, the Janua, and you walk in, and into this home, you see this gorgeous. It opens up, and there's this beautiful room. Let's say 20 feet by 16 feet, and it's called an atrium, and it's actually open. The building, let's say, is 2 or 3 stories high. And it's a central courtyard that is open to the elements, open to the sky. And it has the brick tile roof, the brick tiles where the water drains off the roof and falls into this reflecting pond. This is inside of the house. So you walk through the entranceway. There would be a guard dog there. And there would be the sign that would be saying, beware of the dog. It says, Cave Canem or Kawe Canem. And you see this etched in stone on so many of the Roman ruins, but it just means beware of the dog. Attention, there's a dog. And they would be right there at the door. Cerberus, right? The 3-headed dog. And you'd walk into their household, and this atrium, the walls would be painted with beautiful murals. If this happened to be someone wealthy enough to where they had a massive atrium with a giant reflecting pond, and they were someone who actually had consuls, who were the executive heads. There's always 2 consuls who head up the Senate, and you would have the plaster masks of their faces up on one wall in the atrium. You would have in one corner of the atrium would be an altar called a lararium for the household gods called the Lares and the Penates. And every house in Rome would have these notion that there's not just the grand gods, but there's the household gods, household deities. They're kind of the guardian spirits, the guardian angels of your particular house.
Yeah, which is funny because later Catholicism basically, transitioned that from those to the saints, right, which are still very similar.
Yeah. And if you go to Mexico, right, as you've been, or to Italy and other Italian countries, you'll see these altars in buildings, and it's very much in keeping with these larariums. that you would find. And they would always have the votive candles burning, and they would make an incense offering every day. They would have flowers and fresh flowers, fresh candles every single day. And in the morning, they would have usually some kind of ritual, and then in the evening as well, as they go to bed, at their little shrine. And so on the walls, you have these gorgeous murals, and off of the atrium then are the different rooms. You would have bedrooms, cubiculum they're called. You would have a study, a tablinum. You would have the triclinium, which is the dining room. And let's say the dining room and the study, the den of the owner of the house. This guy who has his hands in so many different economic ventures. And in the dining room, they would have what we would call a chaise lounge. You would have about 3 or 4 chaise lounge around a round table, and people would lean during a meal. And a very well affluent family like this would entertain every single week on weekends, and they would have people over. And people would lean on their right elbow or on their left elbow. Excuse me. They would typically lean on their left elbow, but they ate with their right. And they would be reclining on the chaise lounge. And 2 or 3 people would be reclining on the same chaise lounge with them. They were very large. And there'd be 3 or 4 of them around the table. And they would be turning the platter in the middle. And they would be having this feast. They would engage in for the evening. And they would have servants or slaves, of course. The slave quarters typically were down below or on the very top floor, most likely, in the building. And so you would have this dining room, the triclinium. You'd have the tablinum, which was the study. And then actually, so you traverse from the atrium through these private rooms in the house, the dining room, the study, and then you go back into the garden, the peristylium, or the horto, or the garden, horticulture. So you have the horto. You have this, it's open to the elements as well, to the sky. But unlike the atrium, which has just the reflecting pool, this actually has a fountain, and there's a garden with oftentimes trees, lemon trees and orange trees and Japanese maples, things of that sort, and beautiful flower displays. And the larger the house, of course, the larger the garden. And this would be the back, more private area of the house. And this is where people would entertain for just their best friends. And this is where they'd, especially in warm weather, which of course Italy has virtually all the time. And so they would have this tremendous high quality of living. They would have, within their homes, they would have a room set aside for their toilets. And you think, well, how do their toilets work? Well, basically what happens is think of an outhouse kind of, but instead of just going straight down into a pile with lime, it's going into a trough of running water. The water is running through it constantly. And so that's what their toilet would empty. And the same thing with their sinks. They would have fountains. And they got water pressure the same way we do today through gravity. They would have reservoirs or water tanks, and then the water would flow down through that. And so you open up a tap in your house, and you would get running water, of course, including the fountain in the gardens. And then off of that back room, you would have the kitchen. You would have the bedrooms for the family, depending on how large the family. And so this is what, the Roman, and there are, for example, the city of Pompeii, which is so well preserved because Mount Vesuvius, August 24th in 79 AD, Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the city of Pompeii in 20 meters of ash, well, not 20 meters, about 9 meters of ash and rock. And so it's preserved. And we see mansions with 50, 60 rooms. And these are just for merchants. The Emperor Hadrian had a villa in an estate built outside of Rome called Tivoli, which is about 15 miles to the northwest of Rome today. And you can go visit. It's one of those visited sites in Italy because it's such a splendid Roman ruin. This is the Emperor Hadrian, 2nd century AD. Got it? Good.
So all these houses, this is almost all stone, right? This is all stone.
This is marble. It's stone. It's concrete. The Romans invented cement and concrete, and they built, for example, the Colosseum and the Pantheon had a lot of concrete, but mostly marble. For the finer structures, they would build in marble, but use concrete to reinforce, and particularly, let's say, in the curved dome of the Pantheon. And we'll talk more about the Pantheon when we talk about Hadrian later. But Hadrian's villa, it has 1,000 rooms in it, and it has 1,000 acres or so of gardens. It has huge lakes, which were swimming pools for them. They, because one of the things, of course, that I was going to get to, so a day in the life, right? That's just to give an idea of what you could build. Like, it's like the Palace of Versailles, but on a Roman scale. Granted, the Palace of Versailles is actually larger than the Roman scale, which is incredible, but that was in the 17th century. We're talking about 2,000 years ago, right? So this, let's say you're a patrician Roman or a fairly well-off Roman. You live in this house that we describe. In the morning, what you would have happen, and I'll try to make this really fast. A day in the life, right? You get up, you have a very small breakfast. We're talking about a continental breakfast, so the equivalent of a piece of bread or a croissant. They have a sauce, a fish sauce called garum, which they used and they ate all the time. And then they would drink, they didn't have tea or coffee, but they had different drinks that they would drink, maybe watered wine. They might even drink that in the morning. But fruit juice too was available, of course. They might even have fruit trees in their peristylum in the back of their house, in their garden, if they're lucky. And of course the slaves would prepare all of this for the people. But the owner of the house, his first order of business would be, in the morning, about 8:30, about 10 to 15 people would gather outside of his door, outside of the yanua, the entrance where the guard dog was waiting. And you'd have a slave waiting there as well. And these are his clients, or the clientes, they're called. And these clients are people who either work for him and maybe his secretaries, his stewards, and they're also freed slaves. Most people who are fairly well off will have, a household like this, we're talking would have probably 25 slaves. And it's not uncommon at all for someone to free their slaves when they've done lots of, a decade's worth of good work. And they would set them up in business and they would work for them. And so these are part of their clients. And every morning, every single working day, these people would come and visit the patron, right? Patriarch. These are Roman words. And the father. And he would greet them in his study, the tablinum, which is right off of the atrium. So they would go no further. They wouldn't go into that back garden, the peristylum, where the horto, the garden is. But they would stay in the atrium and they would stay in his study, which is attached to it. And he would conduct business with each one of them. And oftentimes too, what they would then do, of course, is they supported him in business. They shared in his profits, and they supported him politically, because virtually everyone who had any kind of money was involved in the city, certainly in the city, the civic politics of the city of Rome, if they weren't involved in the politics of the Roman Empire, or even in the politics of the area of the Latium River Valley, where the Tiber River flowed. So you would greet these people. Then he would go out in the morning, and he would visit a lot of his businesses after he greeted his clients, and they would follow. Many of them would go with him throughout his day in the morning. Lunchtime, oftentimes he would go back home and have a small lunch. Again, it usually was typically a very small meal. He would have fruit and cheese and bread and olives and things of that sort for lunch, with only maybe 1 or 2 glasses of wine. Also, he might go to a shop or a taberna, a restaurant effectively, and he might eat out. And then in the afternoon at some point, after he's been he might go down to the docks, right, to basically check on his imports and his exports, where they're coming from. Maybe he had a ship just come in, and literally a ship just came in. Or perhaps one is loading up, right, to carry lumber from Italy to other parts of the world. And here, let me interject too, okay? The household. Okay, I talked about the plumbing, right? So they would have spigots with running water. They would have toilets that constantly had water flushing through it. They had fountains. They had sinks. How did they have hot water? Do you know, Ryan? And how did they actually had central heating in their homes. The Romans actually heated their homes. So I'm going to put you on the spot here. And even if you don't know, you can make an educated guess. I'm
thinking, I don't know this is answer. I'm thinking more about reservoirs with fire, something to keep it warm, or some central, maybe heated that way. But it's probably, I don't know. I'm sure they had probably a more intelligent, creative way.
Yeah, they would have a cellar, and they would have a furnace. And what made me think of it was when I mentioned lumber being shipped out. The Romans, every household like this, of course, constantly, to keep their hot water and to keep their house heated, they burnt wood. They didn't use coal. They used charcoal, of course. And particularly the blacksmiths would use charcoal to get the really hot fires. But every home would have a central furnace tended by slaves, and they would be burning a massive amount of wood. Now, during the winter in particular, of course, in order to heat the house. And so they would have they would heat the reservoirs, and they would heat the water, and they could basically run it up to a tank on the rooftop, and then so that's where they would get the gravity, the water pressure. exhaust from the fire, the smoke, right? So we have chimneys, which just basically vents to the outside. They would actually have the exhaust from the furnace run underneath the floors, the brick tile floors or the mosaic floors, these gorgeous mosaic floors that they would have in the beautiful Roman houses. And they would have, it's called the hypocaust system. And so it would run through the walls and under the floors. And so you can imagine how wonderful that was, right? That they went barefoot because their floors were heated. And they had these pools, the reflecting pool in the atrium, the fountains with the fish ponds in the garden in the back. Remarkable technology, isn't it?
Yeah.
With running water, with heated water, and then the heat system running. And then eventually, of course, the smoke itself would vent to the outside through a chimney or through a vent in a wall on the outside going into an alley. Off of the main street. A Roman household typically did not have windows looking out. It would have very small, it was fortified, it was kind of like a little enclave. And like I said, it would have the one door with the entrance and then maybe some back service entrance that was fortified. And otherwise the windows were fairly high up and very small. Everything was focused on the inward, on the atrium with the reflecting pond and the murals there in that atrium, and then of course the garden in the back part of the house. And maybe a house like this for this type of person that we're setting up, we'll call him Caecilius, right? We'll give him the name Caecilius. And Caecilius Unius Secundus. Caecilius Unius Secundus. He, the importer and exporter and moneylender. And he had probably 25 rooms in his house, we'll say. Because, of course, his servants, his slaves, his family himself. He would have various rooms. He would have a library with parchments and made out of both papyrus and then parchment itself, which is animal hide.
Is this
and then wax tablets?
Extended family, or is this? I mean, because obviously this is.
They could. They oftentimes would have extended if they have adopted members. But they would also have the slaves living there. They would have freed servants. And they might rent out rooms. For example, if they do have people who are living on I mentioned that they would have shops on the perimeter, again, for security purposes, because Rome, the streets at night were a little dodgy, right? And so you would have, oftentimes a person like that would have a guard, along with the guard dog, outside of the one main entrance. And they would have a torch burning above if they were wealthy enough. Different parts of the city of Rome had public lighting. And along with all these other things that we're talking about. And so I had mentioned, that the Caecilius might go down to the docks in the afternoon. And then, later in the afternoon, he's going to go to the Roman baths. And in the city of Rome, for example, too, for people, the working class people lived, in the second, third floor, fourth floor. And there also were tenements which went up to 7 and 8 stories high. And there are some at the Capitoline Hill in Rome today, there are some of the ruins of the old Roman tenements that were 8 stories high. And the poorer you were, the farther up in the building you were. And they did not have running water in the building. But there would be maybe a block away, a fountain with fresh water. And so people would be able to go get fresh water every day. And they would have basically a toilet bowl in their home. But also every Roman neighborhood would have public toilets. And so you would have not only the public baths, but you would have an area which was a public toilet. Yeah. And you'd walk into this building and there'd be in the perimeter, there'd be one for men and one for women. But these would be toilets like you would see at any service station in America. And sit-down toilets. And they don't have dividers. They don't have partitions between.
These are the pictures I've seen.
Yeah, I think you remember that one video that we showed that because there's one in Ostia, which is the port city for Rome. And it's a ruin today that you can visit. But even working class people then would have these public toilets. So when they get up in the morning, if they didn't want to just dump their little pot into the street, they would go to the public toilet and they would talk business and they would visit with their neighbors. And it seems amazing, right? For us, this is a very private function, but for the Romans, like so many things, like the Roman baths, and I mentioned our friend Caecilius here. The Roman baths were, imagine the most extensive, remarkable water park you can. And then triple it. And that's what the Roman baths were like. And each emperor who would have these baths constructed would try to outdo another. And I'm talking about, we would have massive domes like the arena here in Spokane that seats 14,000 people. But you would have an area like this with a giant pool the size of the arena floor. And this would be a swimming pool probably about 75 degrees. And then part of it would go outside, and there'd be waterfalls and slides and things we imagined in a water park. And throughout the Roman baths, there would be areas with cold baths, and there would be that's the frigidarium. The frigidarium, frigid, right? The word comes from that. Frigidarium is where the ice cold baths were, and that's the last thing you would go into. You had the steam baths. You had the caldarium, which is where the hot baths were. So like a hot tub, and you would go in there. And they were either free or virtually free. And so even the poorest people could go into, and there would be maybe in a really large array, like the baths of Caracalla. Caracalla was a Roman emperor of the 2nd century. And they were the largest. Nero had his baths as well, Trajan, Hadrian. But you would maybe have 1,000 employees at one of these complexes, right? And so Caecilius would enter in, and there would be a dressing room where he would leave his tunic and his toga, and you would be, we'd be naked. You would have towels with you. Before you go into any of the pools, you would basically have, you would go into a steam bath, and you get all your pores and everything, and then a slave would put olive oil on you, and they would use what's called a sigil. And they would scrape off. They didn't use washcloths. They would use this instrument then to scrape all of the dirt off the person. And they would do this every day. The average Roman would bathe every day. And again, this is something, Americans didn't start bathing every day until the 1950s and 60s. We didn't really have the technology. Most people did not have the means to do so on a daily basis until that late in the game. But the Romans themselves, all classes, would get together in these huge Roman, and granted, there were some parts of the baths were like a private club for the patricians.
Yeah, I was going to ask,
the wealthier people
was there separate
could go.
baths or?
Yeah, there would be. And men and women. Either there were separate, they were actually, of course, on the premises. You would have the part for the women, which was always smaller, or the part for the men, or it'd be different hours, perhaps, in smaller towns, if there's only one complex. But usually it was separate facilities that they would have. And so you would go into the steam bath, you would get all sweaty, they would coat you in olive oil, which would bring out all the dirt to the surface, they'd scrape it all off, then you'd go into the hot bath, into the caldarium, then you'd go into the tepidarium, we get the word tepid, so it's just a warm bath, and then finally you go to the frigidarium, which is the cold. And in the meantime too, you might go out to where the huge swimming pool was. They would have a gymnasium hooked up to it, so a fitness club as well. And so people would be exercising, they would be throwing medicine balls, they'd be lifting weights, they'd be doing acrobatics, they'd do fencing and discus, and this would all be in gardens, in courtyards connected with the baths as well. It's so sophisticated and civilized, right? This world that they created for themselves, and the engineering, the mathematics that they had mastered, these things that they had taken from the Greeks and decided to make very pragmatic instead of so aesthetic. Mm-hmm. The Greeks wanted things to be philosophical and aesthetic. That is beautiful, right? The Romans wanted things to be grand and pragmatic and reflect the greatness of the Roman Empire.
Yeah, it was almost like they would build it strong, but on your point, like when it was an important structure, they'd make like, okay, let's make it look Greek. Let's give it some nice looking columns. Like they would take the extra time on the things they wanted to kind of have the outward appearance. But to your point, like the practicality is what allowed them to build.
Yeah, the Colosseum itself, I mentioned, it's 14 stories high. It has these 4 different levels. And so the bottom level is there's 3 orders of Greek columns, the 3 basic, the most primitive, the simplest. And you could even actually show these. I'm sure you can find some kind of graphic that would show the Doric, which is just a regular column without any kind of ornamentation. There's the Ionic with the little rounded fluted at the top and bottom, and each pediment is different too for which order. And then there's the Corinthian, which has the inverted acanthus leaves. And the Romans liked the Corinthian. It was the fanciest, and so they tended to build their buildings, their art. And they also, the Romans, because of their concrete and because of their engineering, they built arches and domed buildings that the Greeks never could. They could go beyond, with the use of vaults and arches, they could reinforce, and so they were able to build buildings like the Pantheon, the Emperor Hadrian, and this huge dome. We didn't have another building. I said the civilization, human civilization, didn't have another dome until Brunelleschi's dome in Florence during the Renaissance. And then St. Peter's, the one that Michelangelo designed for St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. But the Pantheon, and in the middle of the Pantheon, is this big, huge round circle. If you've ever seen the movie Angels and Demons with Tom Hanks, Professor Langdon is the guy, Da Vinci Code. But it shows the Pantheon, and it has the oculus, which just means the eye. And so the Pantheon was a temple to all the gods. That's what it means, right? Pantheon is basically all the gods from Mount Olympus. So Jupiter and Hera and Apollo and Mars and Venus, etc. Right? And in the Pantheon, it was so massive a building that there would be an alcove or a niche for each one of the gods, an altar, right, to worship, and depending on what you needed. And of course, it's interesting, when it became Christian, they just converted these alcoves and niches and altars to the various gods to the various saints. And it was the same thing. So for the Romans, if you're going on a journey, you might want to have Mercury. Go to the altar to Mercury, the messenger god. And but if it's in the Christian era, you'd go to St. Christopher. So the alcove reserved with the statue of St. Christopher, and you'd make the same. You'd light the incense, you'd put the flowers down, the offering, whatever, and very comparable. And
yeah, it's even
Christians always saw it as monotheism, not pantheism.
Yeah, well, even we've seen that before too with the famous church in Istanbul that was then converted into a mosque, right?
Hagia Sophia.
Yeah, I mean, so it's
Justinian,
changing that core is not uncommon in that way of like, oh yeah, this is built for a certain way, but now we're worshiping a little bit differently. So let's change up the aesthetic.
Have you been there?
I have not. No.
Hagia Sophia.
No.
Yeah, Holy Wisdom. Yeah, it has all the different little domed buildings, annexes to the main central dome, which is just unbelievable. This was built by the Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian in the 6th century AD or CE. And now it's a mosque, because in 1453, the Ottoman Turks conquered it, and it's been part of the Ottoman Empire or Turkey since. And it's part of but it's actually it's a shrine now. It's basically open, and they do have services there, but not really, because basically it's open to tourists all the time. But it is still a mosque, and it has the different scriptures from the Quran, the surahs. There are quotes from dangling down from the ceiling. In an unbelievable place. And that's all part of the Roman Empire. That was built by Romans in the 6th century. So the Roman Empire had fallen in the West, but it did not. It continued in Constantinople. And we'll get there today. So so that's a day, right? And then what would happen after our buddy Caecilius? He would meet with all of his friends there. They would exercise, roll around. They would wrestle, maybe go back and swim around a little bit. And then they'd go home in the evening. Their slaves would have done all the shopping. Their chefs would do all the cooking. And then they would spend 3 or 4 hours in the evening dining. These tremendous meals. There are stories that they would have a vomitorium in the household that the Romans would eat to such excess, these rich stuffs. We have a Roman cookbook. And so they would have pheasant and peacock and ostrich,
Caesar salad,
dormice, unbelievable things that they would eat that we just can't really stomach the notion of. But, the French will eat snails, of course, and frogs' legs and blood sausage. Throughout Europe, they eat tripe, and these are just things Americans are not really.
Yeah, it's funny how you mentioned the
hamburgers.
The vomitorium, because if you look at I remember just in like a modern day novel of Hunger Games, they kind of glorified this, the capital.
Yeah, it was based on the Roman during the Empire, the decadence. Yeah,
and eating until you're too full, and then drinking a liquid to let you throw up, so you could keep eating all the delicious food. And it's funny how that's
emetic, it's called, right? And then you would go to the vomitorium, you would purge yourself. And then you could go back and continue to eat throughout the evening. And you would have minstrels, you would have music, you would have acrobats, you would have trained animals, of course. You would have people singing, and you would have little plays being performed. And you would have this circuit of these homes that you would visit. And of course, you're always constantly jostling, I should say, trying to improve your social status within the empire. Because these main families, right, that run the empire, even during the time of the emperor, Augustus and his followers, his successors, were part of the Julio-Claudian family. His wife, Livia, was part of the Claudian, very wealthy family, and then he was Julius Caesar, Julio. So the Julio-Claudian emperors. After Augustus was his adopted son, Tiberius. He didn't have any. None of them had actually sons who survived, so they all adopted. So Tiberius, and then Tiberius had a nephew guy named Caligula. Caligula was a nickname, but he was a fellow. He was insane, and he's famous for having these unbelievable orgies and doing crazy things and having.
Was he the one that married his horse? I can't remember.
Yeah, well, and he made him a senator, and these kinds of things, right? The famous wild, wacky, crazy shenanigans that went on during the time of emperors. Eventually, the Praetorian, one of the things, Caesar Augustus, okay, he's emperor. This is 27 BC to 14 AD. And he sets up a fire department for the city of Rome. He sets up the Praetorian Guard, about 10,000. So you don't bring legions in, you have the Praetorian Guard. And the Praetorian Guard throughout Roman history after Augustus then is always loyal to the emperor, but they make and break emperors later on. They play a huge role in that, who becomes emperor. And they were the ones who actually killed Caligula. They just said, this guy is way over the top. His uncle Claudius then became emperor after that. And Claudius went to Britain. It was during the reign of Claudius in the 40s that Britain was brought into the Roman Empire. Claudius, there's a great BBC series, it was on Masterpiece Theater called I, Claudius, based on a book by Robert Graves called I, Claudius. And it's written from the point of view of the Emperor Claudius. So if you want to read a book, a great book about what it was like in the first century AD in Rome, from the Emperor Claudius's point of view, read the book, the novel Robert Graves wrote, the author, I, Claudius. And so this is, you were talking about, this, our friend Caecilius. And so he would come home, they would have this fantastic meal, and then they would retire for the evening, right, to their cubiculum. Cubiculi is the plural for the cubiculum, which is the bedrooms that they would have. And then it would start again the next day. Rome, okay, the typical worker in Rome had 160 days off. So it's remarkable, right? They worked 6 to 7 hours a day, and I talked about this before. And on top of that 160 days, every year an emperor would have holidays, and so they would have another additional 20 to 25, 30 days off on top of the 160 days they already had off. And these are freed people. These are people who are not slaves, right? Slaves worked every day, but their life in general in the city, if you worked in the city, if you weren't working in the salt mines or on the galleys, on the ships, your life could be okay. On the farms too, it could be pretty darn rough, the life of a slave. But it was not uncommon at all for slaves to be freed. Greek slaves were the teachers in a household. They'd be the tutors, and they were treated very well, and almost invariably they were freed, and they became a libertus, which is the Latin word for a freedman. And during their lifetime, then they were a libertus, and they didn't have all the rights that a citizen had, a Roman citizen had, but their children would become citizens. And I think I mentioned this before. So this was the life. All these professions. You would have the freed bread distributed on a weekly basis. You would have the markets that would come in, bring in enough food for 1 million people on a daily. The slaves would do the shopping if you were a household that could afford slaves. If not, of course, it would just be like it's done in the world today, where the mom and dad go out and do the shopping. And this was the way it basically remained for the next 500 years. So why didn't they develop an industrialized society? Since they were so, for example, what I mean is, for example, the kind of sewage, the storm drains, the fact that they had central heating in their homes, they had hot and cold running water, they had these bath complexes, they had the aqueducts, they had engineering on such a grand scale, they had these roads, right, enough paved roads to go around the world a few times. So why didn't they develop the modern industrialized world? And there's probably one answer, which is the simplest. Whenever they had a big job, what would they throw at it? What did they have available at their disposal to always work for them?
Yeah, free workers, right? Slaves.
Slaves. And so the slavery was one of the things that prevented progress for the Romans. Even though they had the theory, they had the engineering, they could build. The city of Rome was 1 million people during the Pax Romana. We did not get a city in Western Europe, in the Western world, of 1 million until London in the early 1800s. Again, because in order to have a city of 1 million people, you have to be able to get water and food into that. You have to have roads and sewage, right? You can't have 1 million people and all of their filth, their daily filth, garbage and the other stuff, right, that people evacuate. So you have to have a means to dispose of all that. European cities and American cities did not get sewers until the middle of the 19th century.
Do we know
Ancient Rome had sewers 2,000 years ago?
Do we have any insight on birth rate in terms of, like, because of the circumstances in Rome being so,
or life expectancy? Or
life expectancy high. Was birth rate also higher than we would have seen in a...
infant mortality was pretty high. The one thing that, they had pretty good medicine. One of the guys we never mentioned, the Greeks, of course, was Hippocrates, who began to use a scientific approach to medicine.
Right.
And other people had as well, the Persians and They encountered the Egyptians, and so the Greeks had incorporated with Hippocrates, and then there was a guy named Galen as well, a Greco-Roman physician who was even probably a better physician than Hippocrates, the Hippocratic Oath, which is still said. And so the Romans actually, my goodness, if you look at the surgeon's tools of a Roman, they look just like surgeon tools today. I saw a documentary one time, a British documentary, and it was in Britain. If you live in Britain, the shows that they'll have on prime time are the kinds of shows that we have only on Nova or on PBS. And they'll have this wonderful documentary, and it'll be just about medical practices in the Roman Empire. And so they had this surgeon, and he was looking at the tools of a Roman surgeon in the first century, in the time of the Julio-Claudian emperors after Caesar Augustus, Nero, Caligula, Claudius. And he said, wow, these are just like the types of tools that we basically use in surgery today, but without the electricity. They did brain surgery. They could remove cataracts. They did not bleed people to death, like people did in the Middle Ages. They did believe in some mystical properties to medicine, which is something that lasted up until the 20th century. And people still do, right? People pray. Your grandma gets sick, and people pray, and they think, that it's really, a lot of people believe that that's more powerful than this science stuff.
Our essential oils are probably more common in this.
Right. All magnets, all sorts of different things, right? They're going to be the next magical panacea. So, even in that way, the physicians that the Romans had were so much better than the medieval or Renaissance physicians. If you ever played Assassin's Creed, and you have the plague doctors with their funny masks and just the horrible things that they would do to the human body to try to cure them of the plague. They believed in this whole notion of the four humors and trying to get the balances and the humors. And this is all stuff in the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, even the time of Shakespeare. Shakespeare talks about this stuff in his plays. So the Romans, like the Greeks, had a very scientific idea. They believed, even in their legal system, the great Roman law with their juries and their judges, they had their courts set up in the forum along with their temples. And they had the low court and the high court, and this codified system of law, which was equal for both patricians and plebeians and the equestrian class. Everyone was equal under the law. And that's why so many of the concepts that they developed during the time of the Roman Empire, of course, are still in Latin. If you study law, you have to learn well over 100 Latin phrases, because these were concepts, legal concepts that were developed by the Romans. But they believed that actually natural law was something that was part of the physical universe. That there was just that crime and punishment, what is just and unjust, was something that you could explore, kind of like Socrates, just by using the powers of reason, not by appealing to the gods. During the Middle Ages, they had trial. There's a movie that came out which was actually excellent, but nobody went to see it, called The Last Duel. And in the Middle Ages, they believed that you could challenge somebody, and whoever won was right, and the person who died. So you could have the biggest jerk in the world who just happened to be a stud, and they would always challenge people to a trial by fire, and they would destroy their opponent. And of course, they could always argue that because God would surely not let the bad person win, right?
Yeah. Or more comically in Monty Python, right? She's a witch because she wins the same as a duck, right?
She turned me into a newt. I got better.
Right.
So, this is a picture, and ultimately, I guess back to this idea of this slavery. And this is something that definitely, not only morally, they actually wrote, people had treatises, essays about the fact that slavery was wrong, but it was something that just existed. Jesus never addresses slavery. He does poverty in the Gospels, and he just says that there always will been poor people, there always will be poor people, so Judas, don't worry about it, right? When Mary Magdalene is soaking Jesus' feet in oils, expensive perfumes and oils, and Judas is complaining that those could have been sold and given to the poor, and Jesus says, well, Judas, get over yourself, right? There's always going to be poor people around, and that's just the way of the world. And that's kind of their notions about slavery. Slavery was just, and it was very different. It wasn't based on ethnicity or race like it was in America, where you really have this moral component, and just this terrible sense of wrongness that was done in the United States and in the colonies of the New World by the modern day Europeans. Just in the ancient world, it was something that everyone practiced, and there was much more opportunity to move out of slavery. Yeah. There's lots of stories. One of the most famous novels of the Roman Empire is called the Satyricon. And the main character is Trimalchio, and Trimalchio was a freedman. He was someone who had started life as a slave, and he became a libertus, and he became unbelievably wealthy. Mm-hmm. And he joked about you could go from Rome to Naples and never leave his property, that he owned so much of the countryside of Italy. So
yeah,
do you have a question? Yeah,
just the last point there. I wonder, and I think it's an important thing when we deal with that topic that's just so challenging. And I think that the spot that, as I've reread some of this, that I find unique to the kind of the Romans is this idea of upward mobility. To your point, like, because it wasn't ethnically driven, and it was this idea, and then even your outline of our fictional character, this idea
and
that
inclusive nature, right?
Yeah, the people that you're going to work for you almost have an incentive to almost like train them and help them along, because if they then become freed and work for you, they're going to be part of your success. And so it really is this interesting
wealth.
Yeah, it's this really interesting kind of dynamic of these aren't, so far removed from me. They're almost kind of more, in that quasi family. They're just in this role that unfortunately is not ideal, that we would, love if all things were equal.
And these the clients, right? The clientes would visit your home every single day.
Right.
If you were someone, right, who was in the middle class or above. And this is what you're describing. Absolutely. The history itself, what we have, from this Pax Romana, from the time of Caesar Augustus, and then we have emperors until the last emperor in 476 AD. The Julio-Claudian family, it ends with a fellow named Nero. Nero is famous for playing his lyre, fiddling while Rome burned. And then he did blame it on the Christians, this Jewish sect. And so many of the Christians after the fire in 64 AD, a lot of the Christians were fed to the lions and other animals in the Roman Colosseum. They were burnt at the stake. They were killed by gladiators. Nero himself actually did not set the fire. It's almost a certainty that he did not. He was 20 miles at one of his estates, villas outside of Rome. He actually came into the city. His palace, he was having this tremendous golden palace with about 200 rooms built right where the Colosseum is today. The Colosseum was built after Nero. And so the Great Fire of Rome was in 64 AD. It was the summer of 64. And he came into Rome, and he actually allowed these grounds of his palace to be for the people who lost their homes. And about a quarter of the city. Fortunately, Caesar Augustus, I had mentioned these things. He had organized a fire department, and they were able to put out, and they were, of the districts of Rome, something like the 30 some odd districts of Rome, about 9 or 10 were utterly destroyed. So most of the city they were able to save, but it was the tenement areas that just went up in flames. So we have, and then throughout this first century AD, and this is the century of Jesus of Nazareth, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor who gives the order for Jesus to be crucified, of St. Paul and St. Peter going to Rome, St. Paul being a Jewish fellow who at first persecuted these Christians and then became a Christian himself, having a conversion experience on the road to Damascus where Jesus visited him. And of course, he writes these letters to these churches that he establishes. And do you remember why was he able to establish these churches and basically travel with carte blanche throughout the Roman Empire?
Yeah, he had his Roman passport, which made it pretty nice and easy.
Absolutely. He had a Roman passport. He was a Roman citizen from the Roman city of Tarsus. And so that was, a great benefit to him. Both Paul and Peter, from Christian tradition, Peter was crucified in Rome, upside down, because one of the things he made a mistake. They were going to crucify him as a martyr. And he said, "Oh, this is great for me to be able to die like the Son of God, like Jesus himself." And they said, "Oh, well, we'll crucify you upside down then." So to punish him, so that way Peter was not crucified. And then Peter was buried at what's called the Vatican. It was the Circus Vaticani was outside of the city of Rome on a hill to the northwest. And that's where Peter was buried, and that became one of the earliest Christian churches. And it was called St. Peter's, named after him, and eventually it kept growing in size as Christianity became more and more important. If you look at the piazza out in front of St. Peter's Basilica, right, the largest church in the world, where the Pope lives, and that's where the Sistine Chapel is, that was a chariot arena. It was also a gladiatorial arena. It was both. They were all over this. There were quite a few arenas in the city of Rome. It wasn't just the Colosseum and the Circus Maximus. Yeah. And at this point, maybe too, it'd be a good if we could have that model of Mussolini had built, and we could look at it for a little bit, and you'd see usually most pictures of it. You had flashed it in an earlier episode. Yeah. You can see the Circus Maximus, where the 250,000 people could sit in the foreground. You can see the Colosseum at about 2:00 from the Circus Maximus, the Pantheon. And so these are things right now as I'm talking, perhaps we'll have to.
Yeah, they're really interesting to look at too, because it gives this nice visual layout of.
Yeah, and it's huge, right? It's about the size of a gym floor. Yeah.
Yeah. And what's crazy too is to think about, this is the same challenge you have with these old cities and, things like even Mexico City, where they're building on top of ruins because of the new civilizations and new cities and new people. And so all this history, some gets preserved, but a lot of it gets moved and, things get built on top of, where historic buildings were, because the nature of, the next civilization of that iteration of those people needed that land for something else. And so it's funny as they excavate and find, these deeper ruins, it's because these cities are so old that they've had time to
each other. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I guess, we can wind things up for tonight, finish and I guess we'll probably have another episode where we talk about the end of the Roman Empire and how it, I think we're already going a little bit over probably what we should. But in the 2nd century AD, the Roman Empire expanded to its largest extent. And this is, maybe we could show a map, and not a map that is like the one you've been showing, which shows it at different periods, but maybe one map that shows a single color of the footprint of the Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD. Mm-hmm. The 5 good emperors. There's the movie Gladiator, which has Marcus Aurelius, and he died in 180. And the 5 good emperors preceded Marcus Aurelius, and these were Trajan and Hadrian and Antoninus Pius and Nerva. And these 5 emperors, the Roman Empire got more affluence. It built more structures. Hadrian's villa, Trajan's forum in the city of Rome itself, the different bath complexes, the aqueducts, the cities throughout Gaul, up into Britain. Emperor Hadrian, he decided that the Roman Empire should stop on the northern part of what's called Britain, because he didn't want what we call Scotland. Barbarians called Picts. They painted themselves blue with a substance called woad. And these were these Celtic people, barbaric Celtic people. And so he had a wall, 83 miles long, built right across the northern boundary of Britain, from the Irish Sea in the west to the North Sea in the east. And we probably can get a map of Hadrian's Wall. And this was about 120 to 130 AD that this was built. And you have along Hadrian's Wall, you have these. It's the inspiration in George R. Martin's Game of Thrones for the Wall of Ice, right? In the northern part. That's basically because to the north is the barbarians, and Jove knows what else, right? What is beyond that? And they have watchtowers along Hadrian's Wall every mile. You could, and again, you can for 83 miles, you can get a message from one side of the wall to the other side within 20 minutes. Mm-hmm. Because they could do semaphores or fire or smoke in order to signal from one tower to the next. And they actually had towns set up there as well with families. So the guards there had their families. One of them called Vindolanda, we found a Roman post office in a peat bog. Peat is something unique to the British Isles. It's a type of mud, but it preserves things. It's a hydrocarbon. And so we found all these letters, and they were just regular letters from people back in Rome writing to their family way up there on the edge of the Roman Empire up in Scotland, right?
I find it so humorous too, because it's like Scotland's not that much more land, like in relation to the rest of the empire.
Yeah,
they just said, we've had enough.
Same thing with Ireland, right? They traded with Ireland, but they just had no ambition towards Ireland, and so they conquered Britain and the Celtic Britons. That's what in what we call England today, the Celtic people who lived there were called the Britons. And so that's why Americans don't know why British and why English. What's the difference between English? Well, British, the whole island of Britain, where Wales, England, and Scotland, that's the island of Britain. They're all British peoples. Mm-hmm. The Celtic people who lived in what is called England, we called Britons. The Welsh were called Welsh, and the Scots were called Scots or Picts. And he built this wall, and they didn't conquer Ireland. Otherwise, all of Western Europe. And so what you have then, you begin to get, what happens is the Roman Empire begins to just not work as well. By the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, it's just not the infrastructure, the logistical nature of the empire. You have these tribes migrating from Central Asia called the Germanic people, who for hundreds and hundreds of years been piling up in these vast forest areas of north of the Danube River in the middle of Europe, in what we call Austria and Poland and Czechoslovakia today. And so along the Roman frontier, you have thousands of forts set up in Europe to keep the Germanic barbarians out. Well, what's happening is more and more this migration of all these 12 different Germanic tribes. And then you get what are called these Huns. These people, probably Mongol people this is Attila the Hun. The Huns are not Genghis Khan. That's 800 years later. That's in the 1200s. But Attila and the Huns are people who come in the 4th and 5th century. And they are so savage. There's 250,000 of them on horseback. And these Germanic barbarians are just absolute studs, like WWE wrestling stud type. They're terrified of the Huns. And so they begin to push into the Roman Empire. And also the Roman Empire, they need people in their legions. And so they begin to hire these Germanic barbarians to work in the legions. And so basically they're letting these barbarians into the empire, into the Western Empire. And so Gaul and Britain and Spain or Iberia, all of these different provinces, and even Italy, the Romans had conquered what is now called Romania. It was Dacia back then. That's why Romanian is a Latin language way over in Eastern Europe, by the Black Sea, north of Bulgaria. And so the Roman Empire just begins to not function as well. And the government doesn't. The social contract is not being met. People are not being protected. The services are not being provided in quite the same way. The education is not as effective as it once was. And so the engineering is beginning to fall by the wayside. And it's mainly, the worst thing is the legions themselves, is that the legions begin, and the Praetorian Guard begin to create emperors. And these emperors are no good. They are people who basically are either popular with the troops or they're puppets for the troops. And so the leadership within the Roman Empire begins to weaken. There's a brief renaissance in the 4th century under an emperor named Constantine. And Constantine wins a series of battles. He has this vision before one battle in the year 312. And it says, he gets this vision, and it says, in hoc signo vinces, which in Latin means, under this sign you will conquer. And it was the first 2 letters of Christ's name, Cairo, in the Greek alphabet. And so he put this on the symbol, which was a very common symbol. It's the fish symbol of Jesus in Greek. Right. And they put them on their shields, and sure enough, they conquered. And so Constantine became a Christian emperor. And what Constantine did before he died in 327 is he made Christianity a legal religion. This was very important for the history of Christianity within the empire. Christianity had been an outlaw religion. It had really appealed to the rebel in people, to the slaves, to the common people, where everyone was equal in the eyes of God. And Constantine now said that it is a legal religion, along with the worship of the Roman gods, the Egyptian gods, the Greek gods, all the gods, right? And Constantine himself was baptized before he died. He set up a second capital at a Greek city called Byzantium, over at the mouth of the Black Sea and the Aegean at the Bosporus. This is way over in Greece, right? And it becomes the city Istanbul event. But he called it New Rome, Nova Roma, but his followers called it Constantinople, named after him, Constantine. And Rome flourished under Constantine. So we have Constantinople in the east, we have Rome in the west, and now Christianity is a player within the empire. And what happens is interesting. It goes from being this kind of cool outlaw street religion to being a power broker within the empire. The way the Roman Empire had become, in the 4th century, the way it was organized into about 13 different dioceses, they were called. And a governor would be in charge of the different dioceses. Well, the church then used the same footprint, and they called their provinces dioceses. And instead of a governor, they had a bishop. And a number of dioceses, 3 dioceses, would make up an archdiocese. And so the bishop in charge of an archdiocese is called what kind of bishop? An archbishop. And so this was the organization of the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, was the organization of the Roman Empire. Right. And just like you had the emperor in Rome, the bishop of Rome became known as the father. And the slang way to say father in Latin is papa or pope. And so the bishop of Rome becomes known as the pope. And at the St. Peter's Church, where St. Peter was buried on the Vatican Hill, that becomes the headquarters of this Christian church. And so after Constantine, there is a brief, during the 300s, there's an emperor, God bless him, called Julian the Apostate. And he actually wanted to restore Greek philosophy and the Roman values because he saw the Roman Empire slipping. The Germanic tribes are getting into the Roman Empire, and he fears that the Roman Empire might fall. And so Julian is actually a brilliant man, a great organizer, and he was really an effective emperor. just from the Christian point of view, he was evil because he tried to get rid of the Christian church, which he thought was weakening, because it says turn the other cheek. It says to be a lamb and not a wolf. And the Romans, right? She-wolf. They're studs. None of this Christian forgiveness. And so he wanted to restore the pagan gods and the pagan games and all of this.
Right.
And so he was called the apostate, but he eventually, he died in a campaign in the East. And then you have a Christian, and I'm almost done here. And then we'll talk about the Germanic tribes getting in the end of the Roman Empire. And we'll be done for this episode. And at the end of the 4th century, 60 years after Constantine had made Christianity a legal religion, you have an emperor called Theodosius, and the Christian church calls him Theodosius the Great because he makes Christianity the only legal religion.
Right.
He outlaws paganism. So the Pantheon in Rome becomes a Christian church. All of the Roman temples with the pagan gods become Christian churches or are destroyed. He ends the Olympic Games, which have been going for over 1,000 years. This is in the year 394 because they were pagan. It was a pagan festival. The remnants of the library, the great library in Alexandria, he has the documents of the great Greek philosophers and playwrights burnt, the parchments and papyrus because it's pagan. And this is always the conflict, right, that exists throughout the history of the Christian church. The things which are Christian and the things which are pagan. And if it's not Christian, it's evil. And this is even a mindset that exists today, right? It's even in our politics where one political party maybe represents the party of God and the other one is liberals and everything awful, and of course that gives it away which way. But it's a perception that exists in this country.
Yeah, and we understand that because of that puritanical roots, and it's oftentimes, even though we might be like, oh, I understand that conceptually that I can separate, something from something else, but like, oh, I've been kind of trained to say that that's bad, bad.
So what happens is, as the Roman Empire, it does continue to weaken. It does. It's no longer doing its job. A bunch of Germanic people called the Angles and the Saxons get up into Britain, Roman Britain, and the Romans just withdraw their legions out of Britain. And what's left then is a Celtic king, a Romanized fellow. He would have spoke Latin, and his name was Arthur, King Arthur. So he would have not worn medieval armor, which is always shown in the movies. He actually would have, or like in Monty Python even. But King Arthur of the 5th century, going into the 6th century, fighting off the Germanic invaders of Britain. He was Celtic. He was Romanized. He spoke Latin. He wore a Roman tunic and a Roman toga. And he organized because the Roman legions had left. And Britain was very Romanized. There were palaces. The city of Bath was this whole city, which was basically made up for Roman baths. They had these 2 vast Roman roads. They had Hadrian's Wall. It was very civilized, right? But they withdrew their legions because they had to pull them back to Italy. The barbarians were, because in 410, a group called the Visigoths got down into Italy and they sacked Rome in the year 410. So it was at that time that they pulled the legions, withdrew the legions from Britain. The Anglo-Saxons move in. For one generation, King Arthur is able to hold off these Germanic barbarians. But eventually he's defeated and Britain becomes the Britons leave and they go to a part of France, northwestern France, and it's named for them. So tens of thousands of Britons from Britain leave, go to northwestern France. And do you know what that part of France is called?
Isn't it Brittany?
Yeah, it's called Brittany. It's named after the Britons who fled there, the Celtic people. And that part of France was Celtic too. Yeah, the Gauls were Celtic.
Isn't it also rumored that Arthur comes from the Julian Claudian family as well? Isn't there some tie there?
They tried to make that because, of course, and just like also tying to Constantinople, to Constantine. So either to Caesar Augustus and Julius Caesar or to Constantine. These were always these were the most prestigious connections that you could possibly make them. And it just gave you more credibility, more prestige, more status, right? And so this is, so by the 5th century the Roman Empire was beginning to fail. You even had them in Italy. Like I said, in 410, Alaric and the Visigoths sack Rome. And the Romans say, Alaric, what are you going to leave us? You're taking everything with you as you move on your way back up into Gaul and then down into Iberia, Spain. And he says, well, I'll leave you your lives. Is that enough? One of my students who went to BYU, I always mentioned that Alaric and the Visigoths would be a great name for a band. And so for a project that he was doing an assignment on Leonardo da Vinci. And so he and a friend, they wrote a song about Leonardo. That's my Da Vinci. And he named the band Alaric and the Visigoths. Or Plato's Cave, too, because I always said Plato. That's right. It was Plato. I can't remember which one he used. I think, no, he used Alaric and the Visigoths. But I always said Plato's Cave, too, would be a good name for a prog rock band. So we got the Vandals was another Germanic tribe, and they were so destructive. They went down through Spain in Andalusia. Andalusia in southern Spain is where they settled. They settled in Spain, and then they settled in North Africa, the old Carthaginian part of the Roman Empire. And then they actually went up and sacked Rome in 455, and they were so destructive, these Vandals, that the word Vandal today, of course, means someone who does wanton destruction just for the point of destruction. Mm-hmm. And so you have all these different Germanic tribes, and as the Roman Empire, in 476, there's a tribe called the Ostrogoths, which are just the East Germans. Goth means German, and so we have all the Goths hanging out in high school, right, dressed in black, and so we have the Ostrogoths, and they settled in Austria, named after them, right, Österreich, which means Eastern Empire, and the Ostrogoths came down into Italy, and King Odoacer kicked out the last Roman emperor, Romulus Augustus, in 476. So the empire continued in the east in Constantinople, and actually continued until 1453. In the west, the Germanic tribes. In France, you have so the Gauls, who were Celtic, became Germanized by the Franks. The Franks were a Germanic tribe, and the country France just means what? Franks. Yeah, it just is a modern way of saying Franks. In German, it's called Frankreich, the empire of the Franks. Mm-hmm. The Alamans are the German people in northern Germany, along with the Saxons. And I mentioned this would be a good time just to post a picture of the Germanic tribes, the 12 different tribes that came down, because each one of the tribes has a region of Europe named after them. What part of Europe has the Burgundians? We're a Germanic tribe. What part of Europe is named after the Burgundians? Burgundy. Yeah. Right. Well, what are the odds, right, that the Burgundians would go settle in Burgundy? Here's this area called Burgundy, and the Burgundians come into Europe and they settle in Burgundy. No, it's just fate. Other way around, right? Lombards settle in northern Italy. It's called Lombardy, still to this day. The Visigoths, they actually don't. That just means West Goths, and they went down into Spain. So the Vandals and the Visigoths, the Franks kicked the Visigoths out of Gaul, and they went down into Spain and Portugal, that area. So, basically what happens is the floodgates. The barbarians have been knocking at the door for hundreds and hundreds of years. The Roman Empire was so organized that up until 476, they were able to hold them at bay, but it no longer worked. Things stopped working. So if we say by the year 500, 25 years after the last emperor in Rome, things were really beginning to unravel. The aqueducts were no longer working. So if we go a little bit further to about 540, so 70 years after the last emperor, the Pope is still there at the Vatican, but there's only about 30,000 people in Rome. In the year 400, there was 1 million. In the year 540, there's 30,000. In fact, during the Germanic invasions, they actually made the capital in the western part of the empire in a city called Ravenna. And Ravenna is in northeastern Italy. And they actually had moved it out of Rome. The church remained based in. And so actually in Ravenna, you have these wonderful churches that go back to the 5th and 6th centuries, and they have these mosaics of the Emperor Justinian, who was the Eastern Roman Emperor, the emperor in Constantinople in the 6th century, and we'll talk about him because he tried to bring back the glory of Rome, but did not succeed. And so also then, one last thing. So now we have a new look to Europe. It's no longer a Roman Empire. It's a fragmented, with all of these kingdoms, with the Germanic people mixing with the Romans and then the Celtic people who had preceded the Romans. All the rule is fragmented and local. It's no longer centralized in the city of Rome or Ravenna. Over in Constantinople, in the eastern part of the Mediterranean, it's still centralized in Constantinople. But that, again, is way over. It no longer has much to do with the Western Europe. This is, again, is at the time of King Arthur, the Anglo-Saxons, and that the Germanic people completely take over Britain, right? Mm-hmm. And the Franks establish themselves. The kingdom of the Franks is established in 486. The first king, Clovis, becomes a Christian. He's baptized by the Pope, and he becomes a Roman Catholic. So the kingdom of the Franks becomes the protector of the church, and probably the most viable of these burgeoning kingdoms, after the fall of Rome. So what becomes what we call the Dark Ages or the Middle Ages, because there's no longer trade, because it's not safe. You have these warlords from these Germanic tribes, and they'll sit in their little wooden stockade that they built on top of a valley, and they'll control their valley, and they owe their allegiance to some German chieftain, right, who eventually owes their allegiance to the king of the Franks, let's say, or the king of the Ostrogoths. And so this begins to develop that feudal system, right, where everything is fragmented and local, and people live in villages. And eventually, by the 600s and 700s, we're talking about maybe 2% of the people are literate. There are no more aqueducts. There's no more running water. People don't live in these beautiful homes with murals and hot water and central heating and marble and mosaic floors. They don't have sewers anymore. It's interesting. One of the things that people in the Middle Ages did with the old Roman arenas, they turned them into a walled fortress, and they became slums, ghettos. So in the city of Arles in southern France, where this arena had been for 25,000 people to watch the gladiatorial games during the Roman Empire, it now became a walled city. They used it as a castle, which makes sense, right? And all the arches, the entrances and exits to the old arena, they walled up, and inside lived maybe 200 people. And in the rest of the city of Arles, it was just ruins. And so this is heading into this medieval period that for effectively almost 1,000 years, from 500 AD until 1500, the time of the Italian Renaissance, people lived in much more primitive circumstances. It's true that around the year 1000, that things begin to pick up and change. But for the first 500 years, from 500 to 1000, except for a guy named Charlemagne, things are pretty bleak. And also one of the things that actually helped undo the Roman Empire, that a number of times the plague came. Probably bubonic plague, which was the Black Death, much later in the 14th century, right before the Renaissance. But this was something that weakened the Roman Empire also, were these plagues. And of course, and again, when you look at the German people, the German barbarians, these were migrations and not invasions. And they were there for 800 years trying to get in. The Roman Empire was wonderfully attractive to them, right? This empire of marble, and they were living back in the woods with their tents made out of animal hides. But it is incredible because, right, the fall of the Roman Empire in the West, and people go from these cities of marble to living in these villages where their houses were made, single-room houses made out of mud and sticks. It was wattle and daub houses. Yeah, that's what they're called.
I'm excited to talk about that because I think what's funny is I can't imagine being in such a place where you can be around these ruins, or at least they're in the world.
About that? We talked about that in the class.
Yeah, but yet you think about extreme poverty and without literacy and with a very powerful kind of religious control.
Yep, that was the one unifying thing. Absolutely, you're right.
It's very easy to keep people from seeing the potential of what could be done, and I think that's
why it's so static. There's very little progress for hundreds, if not 1,000 years, because civilization just kind of dribbled away, and these other factors came in, and it just remained local. Like you said, they had to live in villages. They couldn't live in the old Roman towns or cities because there's no agriculture, right? So they had to leave those cities of marble, and the aqueducts dried up, and the arenas became these pathetic little fortresses for people to hunker down in their medieval hovels, right? And so people lived out in the countryside, and everyone in Europe during the Middle Ages, the vast majority lived in villages of 100 people or so, and they were agricultural. And like you said, there would be maybe 10 miles away would be these ruins of a Roman town that had 25,000 people in it at one time. And maybe, it's hard because as a teenager, we think, teenagers probably went to the Roman city and walked through and talked to all of the ghosts, but they would have no knowledge of who these people were.
Yeah.
This is, for hundreds of years, of course, they didn't study history. They didn't know who the Romans were. All they knew is that once the world was civilized, that they built big things. And they had the Roman roads still, but they weren't safe to travel. So for hundreds of years in the early Middle Ages, trade hardly existed. You have the Vikings that come along too, and they mess everything up. So yeah, and this is all stuff we can talk about, right? But this is what happens, right? The decline and fall of the Roman Empire. And even in the East, it continues in the city of Constantinople, but it kept shrinking. It began to shrink immediately. And there was this Emperor Justinian in the 500s who built the Hagia Sophia, that fantastic domed church. And he actually was able to recapture parts of North Africa and even Italy for a while, but it was only during his lifetime. And then what happened after the 500s in the East, Constantinople and its control over what used to be the Eastern Roman Empire just kept shrinking. Because what happens in the 7th century, you have these new people called Arabs, and they have a religion called Islam. And they conquer all of the old Roman Empire in the Middle East. All of Egypt and all of the Middle East becomes Arabic. And it is Arabic still to this day, right? Those countries, Syria, Jordan, Palestine, Iraq, those are all Arab countries. And then across Egypt, all across North Africa too, which have been, and this is in the 7th century. We're only talking about 100 or so years after the fall of the Roman Empire in the West. Muhammad was born in 570. He died in 632, 633. And so, yeah, during his lifetime, the Islam began to spread throughout the Arabian Peninsula. And then within a generation of his death, it had spread all across North Africa, all of the Middle East, and up into Spain. So, but that's another story.
Indeed.
So Rome, the ultimate empire, all things come to an end, right? And people love to think in terms of, well, let that be an example to you, United States or Great Britain or France or Russia, whatever it happens to be, whichever empire, whichever nation aspires towards hegemony over other states, right? That even the Roman Empire declined and fell and faded away. It remained in the church, right? The church was this unifying factor. Its capital remained the Vatican in Rome. And you had this organization of the diocese, but these were religious now, clerical, not secular, governmental diocese. And so that was the one thing, right, that all the people in the West, and I was going to mention one other group too. You had these even more barbaric people called the Slavic people, who spoke a very different type of language. And these are what became the Polish people, the Czechs, the Slovaks, the Russians, the Serbians, the Croats, the Bosnians, Slovenians. These are all Slavic people. And they too were migrating slowly from Central Asia. And so really what happens after the fall of the Roman Empire, you have the old Celtic people who preceded the Romans. You have the Romans themselves, the Greco-Roman people. You have the Germanic tribes, the 12 Germanic peoples that came in and settled throughout all of Western Europe. And the Germanic people left Eastern Europe, and the Slavic people moved into Eastern Europe. The Huns remained in what is called Hungary, right? It was named after them. And eventually there's a group of people from very much like the Turks called the Magyars who moved into Hungary in the 700s. So this is, if you're European, you're one of those people. Your European ancestry. You're either Celtic, which preceded the Roman Empire. You're Greco-Roman, which is Greek or Roman, Latin, right? Or Germanic or Slavic. The Basque people up in the Pyrenees Mountains in northern Spain and southern France are the one exception. There are people that go way back tens of thousands of years. Their DNA is different. Their language is not connected to any other. All the languages really of Europe are all part of what's called the Indo-European language group. And these are languages that go all the way from India up through Afghanistan, Pakistan, all through all the Slavic languages are Indo-European. All the Germanic languages are Indo-European, Greco-Roman. So these are all part of this Indo-European language group. All going back to a single language at one time.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I think oftentimes that's the area that we're less familiar with, even geographically. And so when we think about the people and how they settled, like it's actually nice to kind of go through that and understand, like, oh, like, yeah, I could, like, this makes sense to me. I hear these things all the time, but I don't think we think about it as much because it's just not our area of the world. And so it's usually it's not talked about as much. So I always remember going through that and understanding, oh yeah, this makes a lot of sense why these places are named, and understanding the origins, I think, help us.
So why England? Why isn't it? It is called Britain, but why is it called England? England is named after which of the Germanic tribes?
That's the Anglos, right?
Yeah, Angles. So it was called England, and English is what the language, and eventually called England, right? Named after the Angles, the Saxons. You know, they did get Saxony in northern Germany. That's where they came from. But yeah, Engleland, we're speaking English. So it's a Germanic language, right? Because the Angles and the Saxons who moved in, we don't have any Roman or very few, except for place names, and just really we're talking about a few dozen. Romanized Britain and the Celtic people preceded it. We just don't have any vocabulary from them. It's very, very limited. 100 words at the most from the Celtic people, the Britons who had preceded the Romans, and then most of the Latin that we have in English came up. Most of it came through the French, came up through the Germanic tribes that conquered the Angles and Saxons who had contact with the Romans. And then during the Renaissance, when Latin became such a big language that it came into scholarly English at that period. But it's intriguing because we're a Germanic language, and yet 2/3, about 60% of our language are French and Latin words. So how is that possible that, and it's a very simple answer, and this is where we can end. And this is jumping way ahead in time, but so why is it that 60% of our language, 40% are French, about 20% are Latin, filtered through the French, mainly given to us? Who conquered England in 1066? Do you remember that? A guy named William the Conqueror conquered England in 1066, and he was French. He was Norman. Normans were northern French people, and they conquered England in 1066, and for the next 400 years, the people who ran the show in Britain, the nobles and the royalty, were all French. They were French speaking. They didn't speak Anglo-Saxon. And so the Anglo-Saxon people of Angleland borrowed these French words. In order to speak to their leaders, their masters, they had to learn these French words. But they spoke them in a Germanic Anglo-Saxon way, in an English way. So that's why, of course, we have these French words like important, et innovation. And we say them in a Germanic way: innovation, important, table, orange, and so
it's not too dissimilar. It reminds me it's not too dissimilar from some of the Spanglish that we have with the Mexican and Spanish English influence.
So this was and really I suppose if we think about, we can maybe there's a few other things we can talk about in another episode. Maybe we should jump back into education a little bit more, develop. Maybe we could actually even have a guest. I don't know. That might be too soon. That would be ambushing somebody, I think, to do it that quickly. But and the Middle Ages. Middle Ages is fascinating. It's fun. This is so many of our stories. Virtually all of our high fantasy, including Tolkien, of course, is based on the Middle Ages. When we think fantasy, all the games, the books, the movies, it's medieval. It's not Greco-Roman because that was a rational civilization based on science. And all fantasy is based on a would-be magical realm. And people in the Middle Ages did not, like the Romans and the Greeks, believe in science. What did they believe in? They believed in magic. It was funny because they were Christian, and yet they still believed that there were fairies. Because remember, they lived in their villages, and if there was any kind of threat, they would run up to the stockade, the castle where their lord would live, and they would retreat there when any threat would come. But the forest that covered all of Western Europe was a dangerous place. And so you have the stories of Hansel and Gretel and Little Red Riding Hood. And you go out into the woods and you're risking your life, right? In the story of The Hobbit, Bilbo goes into the Mirkwood, and you go off the trail and there's fairies. There's elven folk right out there. And these are the magical people in the woods. And this is what people believed in the Middle Ages. They believed in all of these things. The things that you have to go back to ancient Greece, prior to the Golden Age of Athens, which was very rational. And so that's why we don't have fantasy based on the Roman Empire, because it was civilized and scientific.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, okay, so I think we'll transition into that. I think that makes good sense. And we'll wrap up anything we have left over from Rome that we want to do as a nice send-off, if we will, so to speak.
All right, well... maybe sharing the menu would be interesting. I have in one of my sources, I have a menu for a Roman meal, for one of those banquets, one of those feasts.
Yeah, a Caesar salad. It's probably is not on the list, I would assume. All right, well then we'll wrap things up. Thanks again, everyone, for listening. Again, the best way for supporting the show is to recommend it to someone else, someone who you might think might enjoy. Bestteacherpodcast.com is where all the links for YouTube, all the podcast players, and then a way also to recommend or nominate someone for the show, as well as supporting the podcast if you so desire. So with that, then we'll leave everyone for a nice send off for. I'm glad a day in the life of a little bit more.
We didn't even talk about the chariot races really, or the gladiatorial games and what that was like, and the fact that thumbs up actually meant death. Because it meant, they would say jugulo, which, that J, which they didn't have, and it meant the jugular. So if actually the people are giving the thumbs up, or the Vestal Virgins, or the Emperor, that meant death. But they can't change that in Hollywood movies because everyone thinks that thumbs down means death and thumbs up means life. And so it'd be very confusing, right, if they did it the right way. They would have to have someone in the audience, contrary to popular belief, that when people put their thumbs up, of course, it actually means death. Because they're talking about cutting the jugular vein and people.
Yeah, so don't come after us for all the details that may have been missed. There's going to be too many to count. So we'll try to cover and transition and hit a few of the important things. But no, definitely great resources. Go out there, learn, invigorate yourself in the history of Rome. There's so much more to be enjoyed. So for tonight, we'll call it. Eric, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for watching. Thank you, Natalie, for that wonderful tribute. I'll call it that. But that's the way it was in ancient Rome. Yeah, good night, good luck. These are send-off. Walter Cronkite, who was the most trusted man in America for decades, was on CBS News, and he would give the news, and then at the end of the program, he says, and that's the way it was, September 12th, 1964. And then Edward R. Murrow, at the end, he was a journalist in London during the Blitz, during World War II, and he would end all his broadcasts with good night and good luck. So
well,
I'll use both, right? That's
we might need the
century AD, the fall of Rome. King Odoacer takes over from Romulus Augustus. Yeah. So good night and good luck. Thanks for watching and listening.
Thanks, everyone.
Goodbye, Ryan.
Bye.
Phew.